Hey, and welcome to this week's coaching video for those of you who are going to be facilitating one of Dayspring's small groups for adults. Those of you who are going to be facilitating your small group on the week of January the 31st, that week that rolls in the first week of February. If you're facilitating your small group that week, this video is designed to help you get ready to do that. So what I'm going to do is look at your small group handout with you, talk through some things. I'm going to give you a bunch of additional verses that are not on your handout that maybe you can incorporate into your discussion time, just things to help you get ready to lead and facilitate. All right, so go ahead and grab your handout, grab something to write with, and I'm going to talk you through some of these things as we look at it together. This week's handout is in conjunction with the Sunday sermon. And of course, in the Sunday sermons, we're talking about who God says we are, how God defines us, what our true identity is. And this week, we're talking about the fact that God says that we are saints. I mean, that's who He says we are. Those of us who believe in Him, God says you are a saint. Now, in the Bible, as we read through the Bible, there are all sorts of synonyms for the word saint. Sometimes a translation will use the word saint. Sometimes it'll use the phrase holy people. That's the same word as saints when you see that. Sometimes it'll talk about faithful servants. Usually that's that word saint. So you see all throughout Scripture God defining His people as His holy people or His faithful servants, His saints. And some verses that you can jot down this week, you can jot down right now as you think about what is a saint? How does God view His people? How does God view His holy, saintly people? Think about some of these psalms that describe those of us who belong to God. Psalm 16, verse 3. Psalm 30, verse 4. Psalm 31, verse 23. Psalm 52, verse 9. Psalm 85, verse 8. Now that's just a small handful. You could do a search. Maybe if you've got a Bible dictionary or a Bible thesaurus, or maybe you use some sort of a search engine. You could search and see where the Bible refers to the saints of God or just saints. This is just a handful of them, but look over those, and it gives you a good idea of who we are, how God sees us, what God expects of us. Obviously, in the sermon, we'll be talking about a lot about sainthood and who we are and what that means. But those are some things that you can look at as you get ready to facilitate. It may give you some more insight as to what it means to be one of God's holy people. But think through some of that between now and the time that you facilitate, and you may discover that some of those verses will slip in very well in your discussion time. So those are some things you can think about. Now to the discussion guide itself, check it out. Discussion point number 1, like always, is going to thrust you into the sermon content and kind of get your group back into that dialogue. If you take sermon notes, which you as a facilitator ought to, that'll really help out this discussion point number 1. In fact, I think the easiest way to get discussion point number 1 going is to say, all right, everybody, get out your sermon notes and let's talk about what you wrote down. What did you write down as you listened to the sermon Sunday? That's a very easy way to get the thing going. And if your small group's like mine, sometimes it's hard to get out of that discussion point number 1 because so many people had so many thoughts and really good insights. And if your group really lands there and camps out there a long time, let them do it. If it's valuable discussion where people are growing and learning, that's a great thing, right? So that's how you'll get started with discussion point number 1. And you're going to move on then into discussion point number 2 once discussion point number 1 just kind of tapers off. Look at discussion point number 2. It says, why are we so uncomfortable thinking of ourselves as saints? And I think that's true. If you were to lead somebody to say the statement, I am a saint, I am a holy person, we're tentative to make that kind of a statement. And this question is just simply asking you why. Why are we tentative to do that? You probably don't need my help in answering that question. Your group's going to be able to answer it just fine. But I think it's safe to say that we are tentative to embrace that title. It just seems to be more than we are. But remember what we're talking about here. What does God say of us? And if God says it, it's true. And time again in the Bible, it makes it clear that if you have turned to Jesus in faith, then you are a saint. That's the sole qualifier. If you believe in Jesus, You are a saint. And really, maybe a kind of a follow-up question you could ask to this one on discussion point number 2, one that's not on your handout. But once you ask the question, why are we slow to embrace this description in this title? And after people have answered that, you may throw out this follow-up question. Ask the question, if we don't believe this is true of us, I mean, if we really refuse to embrace this as a description of our true identity, then what are the ramifications of that? If I refuse to believe it, how will that affect me? That's a pretty good follow-up question there that maybe you can throw out. Now, from there, you move on to discussion point number 3. This is the statement that gets you from the sermon to the group content, from the sermon text to the group discussion text. It says, who we are should affect how we are. That's a direct quote from the sermon. It says, you see this truth being communicated all throughout the New Testament, and one good example is found in James. Now, this brings you to the text that you and your group are going to camp out in for the rest of the time here, okay? James chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. You'll read those together as a group. And let me read them to you real quick right here. It says, if anyone considers himself religious and yet doesn't keep a tight rein on his tongue, he deceives himself and his religion is worthless. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. So James is kind of using this word religion because apparently people were talking about being religious. He says, there's a worthless, this thing you call religion that's worthless. But let me show you what really counts in the sight of God. Okay, so really what James is showing us is what, to use our terminology that we're using, sainthood. What sainthood ought to look like. And he says, if this other stuff is not happening or is happening, I mean, that's a hollow form of sainthood. But if this isn't happening and is happening, now that's the way the life of a saint ought to look. So that's really where you're going from here. And what you're going to have are 3 things. 3 markers, if you will, of authentic looking faith. 3 markers of what sainthood ought to look like, all right? Because who we are, saints, ought to affect how we are. So how so? 3 answers. Look at it with me on your guide. Number 4, it says first, James says that we should exhibit self-control. Now it points you back to verse 26 again. And verse 26 is the one that said, if anybody considers himself religious, yet doesn't keep a tight rein on his tongue, he deceives himself and his religion is worthless. Now, keep in mind, you as a facilitator, the tongue that James points out here in our words, this is just one illustration that he's pulling from that's an indicator of self-control. And basically he's saying we ought to be self-controlled. For example, your tongue. If you can't control it, that's not the marking of sainthood. Now look at discussion point number 5. This is really interesting. It says, what if our tongue control simply revealed the true measure of our heart's self-control? What if my tongue and my ability to control it was simply a tangible measure of how spiritually self-controlled I really am? Now, for some of you, you're going to go, oh, brother, if my tongue was an indicator of it, then I totally lack self-control. But here's the thing. The tongue is indeed an indicator of the spiritual health of our heart. In fact, discussion point number 5 points you to some words of Jesus that show that very thing. So the whole point here is that our tongue, if we're not controlling our tongue, that's an indicator that we really need to work on our self-control. And by the way, the imagery that's used here, there's an imagery that's used here of keeping a rein on your tongue, which is a bridle. The image of a bridle like you'd use on a horse or a camel. But here's the thing about a bridle. A bridle is not just used to stop the animal. A bridle is used to direct the animal. So when it comes to our mouths and our words, we tend to think of bridling our tongue as in stopping the words from coming out, but that's only part of the equation. We're also directing the right words that should come out. So when you and your group are thinking about how am I doing with the words that I speak, you're not just saying what words am I holding in that shouldn't come out. You're also saying what words am I letting out that I maybe am prone to hold in. That's something that you as a group leader can really point out here from James' words. A bridle is not just to stop, it's also to direct. So James is making this point that true religion, as he calls it, or good religion, if you will, it involves self-control. And the tongue is probably the most tangible thing that we can look at that will help us see whether or not we're doing well when it comes to self-control. Okay? Now that's the first thing that you're going to talk through, and you've got a follow-up question there on discussion point number 6. On number 7, discussion point number 7, now you get to the second marking of sainthood, the second thing that ought to be seen in our lives. Number 2, it says a second thing that should mark a saint is concern for others. And then that directs you to back to verse 27 of your reading. And verse 27 says, religion that our God and Father accepts as pure and faultless is this. And it mentions looking out for orphans and widows in their distress. Now, in James' day, if James were just to walk around town and say, let me look for the people who really need some help in our society, the orphans and the widows were the obvious answer in his day. Okay, I mean, that was kind of the obvious overlooked person in James' world, was the orphan and the widow. So look at discussion point number 8 that you have. It says, in James' day, orphans and widows were the obvious examples of people who were being neglected. If James were living today, who might he have used as examples of those who are being ignored? So what you're doing here is you're kind of saying, what are our modern day orphans and widows? And that's not to say that orphans and widows shouldn't even be noticed here. I think in our context, orphans and widows is still part of this answer. But in addition, who are the people in our culture and society, maybe our city? Maybe you need to narrow it down in specific, get real specific when you ask this question. Maybe you need to talk about our own community, or maybe you can talk about the city, or maybe you want to broaden it out. But if James were living today and writing these words today, who would he point out here when he's trying to say, you know, good and pure religion is to look out after fill in the blank? And here's the cool thing about this question: as you do it in a group context, you're going to be getting collective wisdom here, which means there ought to be answers in the group that you just wouldn't have thought of. Everybody in the group should hear an answer or two that they say, wow, I've never really thought about them, or wow, I tend not to see them, because that's the whole point. James is saying there are people who are overlooked and ignored. They're in distress. They need help. Who are they? And his whole point here is this, that as a saint of God, as one of God's holy and faithful people, concern for that person should be a marker upon me, and not just concern, internal concern, but an active concern, a doing concern. So you'll talk about this. That's your second marker. So self-control should be an identifier of a saint. Concern for others should be an identifier of a saint. And by the way, concern for others, as well as, using the right words, when you think about it, doing those things, all we're doing in those moments is reflecting God. I mean, we're acting and doing like God in those moments. Psalm 68, verse 5, write that one down and look it up, because that might be a good segue that you can use as you're discussing. But Psalm 68, verse 5, it says that God is a father to the fatherless, and he is a defender of the orphan. A father of the fatherless, a defender of the orphan, and it goes on to say, because he is holy. So think about that. He fathers the fatherless, he cares for the fatherless, he cares for the widow, because he is holy. And that's a perfect segue into the third marker that you're going to be pointing out. Look at discussion point number 10. A third thing a saint should exhibit is personal holiness. And now this points you back to verse 27 again from James 1, and it encourages you to focus on the second half of verse 27, which, by the way, a lot of people seem to gloss over. But listen to the whole verse. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. So it's not just about doing good for people. It's about cultivating a pure heart. And that's really the key to all of it. And discussion point number 11 on your handout kind of wraps all of that up and helps you talk about how do we cultivate holiness. What are the things that seem to dismantle personal holiness? You'll do that. You'll talk that through. So now what you've done in this lesson is you've been reminded that we are saints. If indeed you've turned to God in faith, you are a saint. And that comes with the responsibility of bearing the markings of saints in how we live. Who we are should affect how we are. And James shows us a few things of how that ought to play out. Self-control, concern for others, and personal holiness. So that should be a really good discussion for you and your group. Of course, you can always finish and kind of, if you need to figure out how to draw the discussion to an end and give a good clean finish, you've got discussion point number 12, which points you to the weekly memory verse. You guys can read that out loud and maybe even start memorizing it together out loud. But that's a good summary statement of everything you're going to be talking about. All right? So this is it. You are a saint. Therefore, go and live accordingly. And thankfully, James has given us some good points here as to what that ought to look like. So you and your group discuss it and talk about how you can move forward in living these things out. All right? Hey, God bless you. Thanks for listening in on this coaching video. I can't wait to see you again soon. I hope you and your group have a great discussion time.
Go marching